So finally, Sonoff came out with their own version of a dimmer after all this time. So let's see if it makes the cut, what's good about it, what's bad about it. Let's check it out. So looking at the Sonoff D1 Dimmer, it's a weird little dimmer that actually gets installed inside the wall, but yet no wires from the outside of the wall attached to the dimmer itself. You say, well, how do you control it then from the wall? Is it just going to be hidden, put a faceplate over it? Does it fit the rule of never remove functionality while adding functionality that we follow? Well, kind of, I guess. They want you to use their 433 megahertz remote and actually attach it to the wall. But of course, what if someone runs off with the remote? Because it does just pull off of the wall plate itself, and that way you can use it remotely. But what if you lose the remote? Well, it's not something we really liked. At least on the Shelly dimmer, they did put 2 switch inputs on them, but then you need a momentary switch, and those can get expensive. Then you only get 2 buttons instead of 3 buttons like you normally would see on a dimmer here in the US, and it further confuses people. So it's not really a solution for me either. But can't speak for all countries. I don't know how their dimmers typically work in their wall. Because typically we do like to use the Martin Jerry dimmer, where you do get the 3 buttons. You get your on and off, and you get your down, and you get your up to do the brightness as well as the on and off. Makes it real simple, and it's inexpensive and easy to pop in the wall and put in and replace the switch. So let's dive into the Sonoff D1 dimmer and check it out. They do claim it has DIY mode. It does say LED 150 watts or incandescent 200 watts, 100 volts to 240 volts. So small little guy. It's really designed to actually go inside the wall, the switch box, or whatever. Kind of probably trying to follow kind of in the footsteps of Shelly and their dimmer and or their success with their in-wall switches. But maybe. So there is a little switch that you can flip right here. I'm assuming that's probably for like an OTA mode. That way you could flash your own firmware too. But there is a little easier way than that switch. So as you'll notice, there's nothing really on the front. There's really only the 3 terminals, which are your neutral, your line in, which is your hot, and then your line out. But of course, there is a screw, so let's dive on inside. So it looks like there is a 2-board design, much like how their Sonoff Basic R3 is. Because apparently, I would say that there's like a daughter board. This is with the different ICs as well as the ESP8286, or we'll zoom into that one a little bit, whether it's an 8266 or 8285. So they basically probably would be able to unplug this daughter board, much like they did with the Zigbee version. That way they could change the radio out and still keep the guts for the dimmer. So let's take a closer look at some of these. It does appear that's an ESP8285 chip, which is basically the ESP8266, but with the onboard flash memory. So yeah, that's that switch on the front. It does say OTA. So it looks like they were going to put an LED, but there's no LED. And looks like possibly a Wi-Fi switch you could have turned it on and off with, but they decided to remove that. And you will notice there's a 2, a 0, and a 4. I did pin these out earlier. This is actually GPIO 2, GPIO 0, which of course is for flashing, and GPIO 4. These aren't through-hole vias. They're just going to be small pads. In this setup, it does appear, when we did check it with third-party firmware, that this IC actually does the dimming, and the ESP chip sends over the dimming packets to this chip, much like a TUA MCU setup. So on the other side, they even come down and they do label them for you. For ground, E for ESP, TX, RX 3.3 volts, and the ground plane on the back. And then this apparently goes to the other IC. So it was really easy to flash. I didn't do any DIY stuff. Just like the Sonoff Basic, I just held the pins in there, and then I did tap and hold a jumper pin to GPIO 0 when we applied power. So luckily they do label a lot of stuff. This is on the dimming circuit itself. So they do call this the D1 power board, as well as it does have the MOSFET underneath inside this big heat sink, which may be hard to see, but let's see if we can flip it over. And currently at the recording of this video, I did flash the Tasmoto firmware to this guy, but there isn't any support in it for Tasmoto at this time. Possibly in the future. We did test it with the stock firmware. So once you do pair it, and I didn't see any other options to do any type of MQTT or whatever it might be, like some other stock switches do. But nevertheless, we're just going to check out the EWeLink app. Maybe later on we'll get some additional firmware to support it with Tasmoto, and that way you want to use the EWeLink app. And on the dimmer itself, you can turn the brightness up and down. We are using a dimmable LED, but the range of the bulb is kind of weird. And even going down to 1%, it still doesn't, it gets pretty dim, but just not all the way. And there's not a whole lot of difference. And I didn't see any way to really calibrate this. They did have a brightness range. And it looks like that just really cuts the lower, it chops the lower brightness off, which is not what we're looking for. We had plenty of lower brightness. I'm assuming they're doing that for some bulbs. If you dim them too much, they'll just start flickering. We don't have that issue. So in the remote, let's see the remote. This is the remote, or say the wall switch. And this is supposed to turn it off. Possibly. This turns up to 100%, which I'm not understanding. 100, 60, but there's no difference in the brightness of the bulb at all. Now if we go to 1, that's 40. Not seeing any difference. I'm not seeing how we can just... These seem to be set points. And then that puts it down to 1%. So it looks like we get 1, 40, 60, and 100. And then we should be able to turn it off. Maybe. One of these buttons. There it goes. It's like this button up here. Very confusing if we're trying to... That should be turned on. I guess that's turned off. Yeah, this is the on and this is the off. See how that could be very confusing to try to show someone this is the on and off button and then the different dimming points. But there isn't a dimming up and down. So I guess you'd have to use the app or your voice assistant. Very weird. Honestly, this just makes it even worse for me. They definitely missed the mark on this guy. So one of the issues I have with it, of course, is just using that wireless remote. It should have a way to control it physically with some switches. Well, Shelly tried to do that with their Shelly dimmer, but they should have included 3 switches to be able to control it, not just 1 or 2 or whatever it might be, because that does get confusing with the typical dimmers that you see in the US. And not to mention, by the time you do tack on, say, a momentary switch with 2 switches plus the dimmer, that just puts you way beyond even doing some of the Z-Wave dimmers. Definitely just not an option for me at this point. But of course, circling back to these issues with the Sonoff dimmer, using that remote, it just isn't very functional for the person that is controlling it. They're used to just a standard switch inside the wall where they can turn it on and off or slide it up and down with touch or with rocker buttons. Plus we'd have the issue of the remote not fitting in the switch box. It just wouldn't cover any of the thing. We had to put it next to the switch, and then the dimmer would be in the box. Then we had to put a blank on it for some reason. That would just be weird. So I just don't see it as a good US product. I'd like to see them come out with a dimmer that does have an ESP8266 and does have 3 buttons built into it, much like you see with the Martin Jerry dimmers that have worked out so great. And then while they're at it, to complement it, make a simple little 1-gang switch with an on, an up and down, and light indicators for low, medium, and high. And that will be their fan controller, which uses properly sized fan capacitors for US voltages. Sonoff could sell a ton of those, especially if they did them ESP8266 based, much like they did their iFan 02 and iFan 03. But just put it in a 1-gang pop-in replacement for the US crowd. And of course, don't forget the other crowds that had the different size boxes. Make them a fan controller too that'll go straight in the wall. So that's about it. I did appreciate that they did do an ESP-based chipset in the dimmer, but it has a few more issues. Maybe they can hit it out the park with version 2. As well as the tinkerers, we do appreciate you did the open pin headers to make it easy to flash as well. And soon we're going to do another video on a little sneak peek of some Sonoff projects right here with some different sensors. So stay tuned for that. Of course, hit the bell icon and the subscribe button. You'll catch that video. I do appreciate all the Patreon subscribers. It helps bring new projects and products to this channel each week. And y'all take care.